Okay, Colin, friend and colleague, currently as a colleague, Professor of Psychiatric Social Work, I think, at Bournemouth University, Professor Emeritus in the School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry in Southampton. And the title of today's session is From the Lunatic to Mental Hospital. So we're talking about quite a journey, but it's a personal journey. It's your journey. It's your journey of practice, research, but ostensibly practice. And you shed a light into where we are now, but a very keen and a very personal light. And I think I probably want to stop and hand over to you pretty quickly, because this is a long journey and one worth listening to.
Well, that's very kind of you, Richard. Actually, I'm talking about my career before I became a psychiatric social worker, because after the Royal Air Force for 3 years, I became a psychiatric nurse, or rather a student psychiatric nurse in 1957. But actually I had to go back a little earlier to set it in historical and legal framework. In 1820, in a spirit of generosity to the late King George III, they passed the Lunatic Act, Lunatic Asylum Act of 1820. And this was enabling to actually take care of people, because the word asylum is a beautiful word. It means protection, it means care, it means concern. But unfortunately, in 1820, the Act, as it was laid down and later even amended, had one terrible flaw. It told you about admission, compulsory admission, and that was being certified as insane. There were no systems of discharge. In fact, the person who actually admitted you to the lunatic asylum was a magistrate, and only a magistrate could declare that you were sane.
Okay.
Now, you could make appeals if you had important relatives, and you had to then live outside unaided for 72 hours, and then the magistrate would say, if they can live outside for 72 hours, they're sane and therefore decertified. But of course, as you know, the Queen, the members of the House of Lords, prisoners and lunatics can't vote. And in 1830, my future hospital, the Wakefield County Lunatic Asylum, was built. And some of you may have heard of Bentham, this idea of best for all. And he developed what was known as a pentatique, a kind of star building, so that there's a central pillar with floors, 4 or 5 floors high, so that in the middle of the middle, people in authority could look down the 3 corridors without having to walk down, so people could be observed. And of course, because there was no form of discharge, when people got admitted to the mental hospitals, or rather the lunatic asylums, they were there for life, in effect. 1890 it was modified, but again, you had people declared insane, for example, because of moral insanity. And that was for women who had either 1 or certainly 2. If a woman had 2 illegitimate children, she would find herself in the lunatic asylum. And also, you see, this meant that they weren't called nurses, they were called asylum attendants. So oddly enough, mustn't fast forward too quickly, I admitted my first patient, a boy called Malcolm, in 1957 under the soon to be repealed 1890 Lunacy Act.
Right.
And why I remember Malcolm, because he's 1 year younger than me, and he shared the same birthday, and we might come back to him. So mental hospitals wasn't a term used until 1935. Now, interestingly, in 1935, for the first time, they allowed voluntary patients. Voluntary patients. So people could go into hospital, and of course, they were now called hospitals. But of course, the problem is culture doesn't change very quickly. And when I used to go on the bus to the hospital, as it was called, the hospital, the bus conductor, as we had in those days, would shout out, "Asylum corner," and we'd all get out at Stanley Royd. And I want you to remember, I joined there in 1957, Yorkshire in 1957, January. It was cold, it was grey, it was snow on the ground, and you'd got this soot-caked building, massive monument, these 5-star, and of course there were two, because men and women were strictly segregated. The staff all wore a uniform. We all wore a black suit, believe it or not, a black tie and a white shirt. You might have thought we're undertakers, but it was uniform. Now, the thing about the mental hospital in the 30s, it offered people of limited educational background a secure job. So to become what in the local language was asylum attendant was a really good job, because, you know, you got a job guaranteed. You might have 10-hour shifts, 8-hour shifts, on nights 12 hours, and you'd rotate afternoons, mornings, etc. But you wanted a job there. So because of the institutional nature, because I had a lovely sports field, because the patients on Saturdays and Sunday afternoons would be taken there, totally disinterested in the cricket or the football, but it gave good PR. And I'll come back to the cricket because that was my salvation. Yeah. So a lot of these attendants were cricketers, band players, because the hospital had its own band, rugby players and things like this. And this was really quite something.
And, and presumably ex-military. Ex-military? Sorry.
On it.
Yeah.
Some were from the First World War. And indeed, can I say this? What was really quite tragic, I remember in the 50s, we had patients from the First World War with what was called general paralysis of the insane, namely syphilitic neurodegeneration. Quite a lot. And there, actually, I met patients with delusions that they were Kaiser Bill, they were King George V, and so on and so forth. But certainly, when I arrived there, a lot of these men then were immediately into the army. And one man I want to talk about personally, he'd spent 2 years in North Africa and then 2 years in Italy. So a lot of these men came back, had a lot of education through the military, through the Royal Army Medical Corps, and as I did in the Royal Air Force, and some of them were sick berth attendants in the Royal Navy. So they had more education, but of course they came from this institution which was closed. And I don't want to talk about Goffman, but students will know the word Goffman and closed institutions, because when you read Goffman, for me, who was there, looking back, Goffman sounds like a Sunday school story. So I want to tell how it really was. One of the problems was in the grounds of the Stanley Royd, in the late 30s, they built a new hospital, mainly orthopedic, for severe injuries to miners in the coalfields of the West Riding. And that was Pinderfields Hospital. And they were general nurses. And there was a very strong rivalry between the nursing hospital, where male nurses going in the general hospital were considered by we in the psychiatric hospital as somewhat effete, because in the hospital, we called it a hospital by this time, but the men on the floor, they talked about this is the shop floor. They turned it into a military institution because there were ranks. Now, normally the students, we were trained, we had 6 weeks block training, then we have 1 day a week release and go to the nursing school, where Mr. Stenton, our tutor, big burly ex-rugby player, quite an intelligent man, but he simply told you two things. I'll use the language. They will never hit a patient, You will never trust an epi, that means trust a person with epilepsy, because epilepsy are seen not to be non-mentis compos, therefore they may tell something out of order, and you always obey an order. And of course, all the male nurses of my generation were also ex-military. So everything was segregated. And of course, in many ways, I have to be honest, it was more like a prison because of the nature of custody. You see, we students went on the admission wards, right? There's 2 admission wards, and then there were 2 sick wards, wards 35 and 36, where patients were physically ill, had operations, etc. Because of course, a lot of these patients were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and well, very few got beyond the 70s. Because one of the problems was our hospital, like most mental hospitals, ex-asylums in Great Britain, because of the overcrowding, we had chronic TB. So my student nurse's home was in the ground of Mitchell Lays, which is a TB hospital, entirely from patients from the psychiatric hospital, even in the 50s.
Good grief.
Which was, you know, quite amazing. So you got there. Now, what was it like? It's actually technically it's a Victorian building because it's built in 1830. Heavy, massive stone, everything else, and because of the air pollution, it's bricked, etc. We had padded cells. We had straitjackets. Back to Mr. Stenton, big burly Mr. Stenton, intelligent man, but he could quote verbatim the handbook for mental nurses. Now, when he said mental nurses, he really meant we asylum attendants, because he'd been an attendant, but he'd got himself qualified, and unusually he got doubly qualified. And clearly the man was intelligent, but he belonged to that institution. So the doctors were rather like the doctors, if you like, in the military. We were the NCOs looking after the inmates, patients. Prison officers are the NCOs looking after the inmates, the prisoners. In the mental hospitals of those days, the nurses, or nursing attendants, as they were then now called, we were looking after the patients, and the officers were the officer class who you occasionally listened to, but nobody took them very seriously because the hospitals were run by the NCOs as the Army and the Navy are run by the NCOs, as any decent officer will tell you. But there are some good things about that and also some close things, because of course, as an ex-serviceman, it seemed normal. I'll be honest, when I got there, because I had quite good training in the Royal Air Force, I found a number of things shocking. One of the things we found, of course, were people admitted because of the moral defective, idiots, imbeciles, and even political.
Yeah.
There was one man I used to kind of befriend, highly intelligent man. There was a big question mark about it. And he'd been there before the Second World War, and definitely read Das Kapital. He's now in his late 60s, 70s. He was peculiar, but I'm not quite sure why he was peculiar. Now, of course, 1957, there's a lot of talk of changing the legislation. And we knew the new Mental Health Act was coming in, which it did in 1959. Now, I'm there amongst everybody else. And of course, I'm voracious, reading various things, etc. And by accident, I'm starting A levels. And so I wasn't the top of the nursing group. Hang on, her name, I'm blocking her name. Evelyn Mew, she became top and I was second. There was a nice rivalry there. But of course, the lads backed me because, of course, of the segregation and so on. And of course, we had a new hospital superintendent. Now, you know the difference between, I'm going back in the 50s.
Okay.
Do people know the difference between God, the hospital superintendent, a professor, and a consultant? God does not think is the hospital superintendent, a professor, or a consultant. And these people. So Dr. Fletcher, in my second year, there was nearly a strike, because up to that time, to my surprise, I was on the admission ward. The men on the admission ward had two pots, two enamel pots and two spoons for their main course and their pudding, because they wouldn't be given knives, because as some of the old, now called nursing attendants, said, you can't give lunatics knives and forks. But we did. Dr. Fletcher insisted on instituting knives and forks on our admission wards, not the back wards yet. There was they were threatened a strike, and the chief nursing officer, Mr. Hollingworth, I was one of his prizes because he could see I was the new generation, and there were a few like me, the new generation. And of course, being the new generation, some of the older guys were a little bit suspicious, but they, of course, appealed to our military loyalty and allegiance. So it was easy to fit in, though you might want to behave slightly differently. But we started having knives and forks. And do you know what happened on the ward? Everybody had to sit at the table. The kitchen men, and these were men who were reasonably mentis compos, etc., but had inside jobs, collected all the knives and forks and counted them. And we had to count the knives and forks before the people at the tables were allowed to leave. This is in 1958. Okay, that seems a long way away to you, but this is a mental hospital. And of course, the new Mental Health Act, and dare we say something nice about Enoch Powell, it was his aim, and he, of course, wanted to develop care in the community. And of course, the Conservative government cheated. They talked about care in the community, reducing hospital costs, but didn't pass the money over to care in the community. So care in the community was always grossly underfunded. This is an objective fact, and I can give you the figures if you want to. But one of the things I want to talk about, to give you the ethos, the hospital, of course, had a farm. Now, these men were taken out in buses to the hospital farm and frankly worked as farm labourers under supervision. And one of the overlookers, he's a nursing attendant, was a wonderful man called Harry Hartley. Harry Hartley was on the borders of being a rugby league international. He got caught with the war, got a leg injury. But Harry Hartley is 6 foot, all muscle, and very, very hard. And Harry Hartley was known as the Vicar. Now, the Vicar, if you were of an interesting kind of personality, indeed, if you had a personality, Harry Hartley would give different people a nickname. Of course, the superintendent was called God's God. Harry Hartley. So all the staff would refer to Dr. Pritchard as God's God. Mr. Hollingworth was called the Bald Eagle. And I was working on the ward for 3 months with Harry Hartley. And Harry, of course, he's an ex-medic. I'd seen some conflict and we, you know, could yarn a bit. But of course, he'd seen far more than I did. And one day I was sat at the breakfast table. And of course, we're served by the patients. You know, we're not there to look after them. We're there to supervise them. But there's no treatment. I mean, some are on drugs, some are not. It's simply just housing them. We're housing them. That's, you know, I can see that now. I didn't see it at the time. And I was a bit rude to Harry. I joked. Now, Harry didn't like being outwitted. Harry Hartley put his arm across the table and picked me up sitting and just banged my head against the wall and said, "Don't be bloody cheeky, lad." But Harry called me the professor. So believe it or not, Harry Hartley was a man of foresight because has read all these books. Now, you must realise, reading books from a working class background, this is no exaggeration. My father was telling me that he'd met an old friend of his on the bus and saying, what's your Colin doing then? And my dad said, oh, he's at Stanley Royd. Oh, I'm not surprised. He read so many books.
That's a lovely story.
But the thing about Harry, if one of his lads was ill, after his shift, he would go and not nurse him, he'd look after him. And when I was on the sick ward, as we were on mainly admission wards, mainly sick wards for our training, and in this sense, the training wasn't too bad, but I did get accused of talking to patients too much. You know, you mustn't be talking to patients. What are you talking to patients for?
Yeah, okay.
Harry would go down and look after his lads. I knew I'm not nursing, he said. This is one of my lads, because Harry was a sergeant and he knew how to look after his lads. So there was a lot of kindness, very rough kindness. But equally, there was a tension there, because absconsion was the thing we had to avoid like mad. There was subliminal levels of violence, very often patient to patient. And one example, because I want to talk about him later, there was one patient, I can name him because he's not alive, and he had the name of a then famous politician, George Brown. When I was doing on my back ward on Ward 16, which was horrendous, the men were toileted every 2 hours. So one gallery was toileted 1 hour, the next gallery was toileted the next hour, and you simply toileted them like that. The men were herded into communal showers, naked. They were just herded. And the thing about George Brown was that when Mr. Stenton wanted to teach us about schizophrenia, about mental illness, it was all almost a kind of organic form of psychiatry. And indeed, sociologists talks about reification. So concepts became things. And George Brown would be brought in front of the nurses. There'd be about 25 of us students. And he was catatonic. And George would sit there, just stand like that. And he'd be asked his to raise his hand. Say something, George. Couldn't speak. Stand his head. And just stand there. Catatonic. His eyes, you'd look at his eyes, he wasn't there. And the thing about George was that ward's kicking post. Two patients had a scrabble or scramble or whatever you like, and somebody hit George. George was badly scarred, and I just felt sorry for George. So occasionally I gave him chocolate because he'd just stand there. And of course, he literally had to be moved around. He took no notice of anybody and so on. And he was the extreme. He was described as actually being in the hospital so long. He was quite a young man when he went in, about 17, 18, dementia precox, which is a word we used before the word schizophrenia came. And he was totally institutionalized, but totally catatonic. And I used to feel sorry for him and give him chocolates or a biscuit or something like that. And just perhaps even pass the time of day. Because, I mean, I'll be honest, the worst thing about being on Ward 16, it was totally oppressive. And of course, we were not welcomed as students. We were tolerated. And of course, you had to do it to say you'd done it, you know, to sign your book. But this was just herding people around. It wasn't nice at all. So, yeah, thinking of George. No, I won't go any further. I think we have to talk about this violence, and sometimes I think there were casual brutality. I got once or twice hints of deliberate brutality, but these guys were very clever and they hid it. Most of the time, the men who looked after the patients did modestly reasonable job. They'd inherited a system. They'd come from, and I can't emphasize this enough, an ex-military hierarchical situation. And to show you the extremes of that, this is the last time I ever deliberately struck somebody. He's dead now. His name was Vince Young. He was the deputy charge nurse on Ward 35. And we had a man dying of Huntington's chorea, which is a terrible genetic neurological deteriorated illness, and so on. And Vince Young was stood with this man's wife, arm around her, fondling her, and telling this patient that he was having a sexual relationship with his wife. And I stood there thinking, what the hell's going on here? And the patient understood what was going on. And was his career, his movement, or did this man understandably, perhaps, try to strike Vince Young? And Vince Young did that. And I shouted to him, "You don't." And he said, "Who the effing are you?" And he came for me. I'm glad he threw a punch, because I hit him and knocked him down. And then could have warned him, "I'll restrain him." Now, all very quiet. He got up. "I won't hear the last of this, Pritchard." There's a wife there. She starts crying. She goes out, and the poor patient is distressed. I'm distressed, and I calmed down and carried on. The following day, I'm called to the deputy chief male nurse's office, a Mr. Tudor, who happens to be the uncle of Vince Young. Because one of the things I should have mentioned, because it was such a secure job, there were families, generations of families who'd worked in the hospital. Indeed, my subsequent hospital I worked in had this exactly the same format. And Mr. Tudor had me standing to attention and said, "You struck a senior officer." I said, "I'm not interested why you did it, Pritchard. You're ex-military. Okay, you're only the bloody RAF. We know what Nancy Boys, because after all, he was ex-army, etc., etc., etc. We know you Nancy Boys are in the Royal Air Force. You do not strike an officer. Don't say a word. You've got one choice. You apologise to Mr. Young, or I discharge you straight away and send your student papers back to the GNC as professionally unsuitable."
Wow.
This is my third year. So what do? I go and say, "I'm sorry it happened," which was true. And that's as much as I did do. But I was threatened with the sack because I protected a patient. So this was a kind of the problem. Now, again, we have to look at the world of psychiatry was then. And what is so important to professionals today, students, whether they be medicine, social work, psychology, nursing, education, it's got to be evidence-based. In my day, in the 50s, we had leucotomy. As it happened, as you know, Beryl was a theatre sister. This is where we met. She was at Pinderfields. And yes, I should tell you, I was going out with Margaret, who was one of the local psychiatric nurses. When I dropped Margaret for Beryl, who was the Pinderfield nurses, I was ostracised by some of my, because I'd let the side down by going with those posh people at the Pinderfields Hospital, the General Hospital. But Beryl was, of course, theatre sister in neurosurgery. And when we talked about this, I remember saying to one of the surgeons, "Oh, Colin, is very simple." He said, "I'm just a technician. If the psychiatrists say they need a leucotomy, we have a leucotomy." And what was really about was behaviour control. If some of these men, because after all, some were in their 30s and 40s, quite tough, and they were sometimes aggressive or counter-aggressive, the word got out that they were unstable. A little tree fine, a probe, turning around in the frontal lobes, and they were turned into zombies. We also had insulin therapy. Somebody had this bright idea of there's a problem with schizophrenia because they're difficulty in sleeping, etc., etc. Their blood levels are low, so we'd give them high levels of insulin. One of the problems is they became massively fat, and nationally, 1 or 2 people died. After a while, they realised, apart from 1 or 2 people dying, and then also because of the too much insulin, and then later on dying because of cardiac problems because overweight, it didn't do much good. Then we also had aversion therapy, aversion behaviour therapy. This at the time was given for male homosexuals. Now, homosexuality was not decriminalised until 1967. Now, I think it's fair to say in the hospital, we accepted people as they were, but we thought we were doing them a favour, because if a man being found by a police and being charged, in effect, they were given a, if you like, what's the word? I'm having a senior moment, a Goethe-like Faustian pact. Admit you're ill and go for treatment, or you go to prison. So these men would come to the unit. And of course, this is new therapy. And of course, some of our doctors were keen to do new therapies. And this is new aversion behaviour therapy. So I have to tell you this, I was a rather bonny lad at the time, which was a bit embarrassing. So I was chosen because what we would do, we would have this dark room. What we then had, we didn't have things like this. So we'd have a poster of a man called Nureyev, a fantastic Russian dancer, superb physique, and you might say formally homoerotic. And we'd give these men drugs and various other things, and they lay down, and then I would read them a homoerotic story to deliberately get them aroused, looking at Nureyev, and then I'd press a button to give in their veins a drug which would give them the most violent cramps and vomiting. I had got adrenaline if in fact they went into cardiac shock, and we had a doctor on call if we needed one, but this guy would go into the most excruciating nausea for 20 minutes, sometimes may last an hour. And the idea was, theoretically, and there were papers written on it, to cure them of their homosexuality, to have an aversive reflex action when they saw something homoerotic. But we thought we were doing well.
Yeah.
We did our best. Other things.
Can I just make that cut? Can I allow me, because I think we'll reflect back on this in a while. But you know what you've just described, you know, as we listen to that now, is shocking, and for you it's shocking as well as it is for me. And I know we've shared these stories before, but it's still shocking. But I want to just you know comment on the fact that what we're talking about is cutting edge, evidence informed practice. And I know you've alluded to that, but I think it's really important just to remember that what we're looking at, you know, I know it's for its time, I know we're talking about historical moment, but cutting edge, evidence informed practice.
I couldn't agree more. We had something called autism. Yes, let's fast forward. I left psychiatric nursing and became a trainee psychiatric social worker. I was trained at the Department of Psychiatry, University of Manchester Medical School, and I became a principal psychiatric social worker.
Yeah.
Of which I see myself still as a psychiatric social worker. One of the problems we had in the early 60s was autism. Now, there was a man called Leo Kanner, who was a Freudian egodynamic, and he described autism and blamed the parents. He actually said, these are detached parents. Mm-hmm. And he used the phrase refrigerator parents. And that's what we were taught. That's what we were taught. You must remember we were taught these textbooks. Yep. Now, my old prof, the late and great Max Hamilton, he died in 83, because sometimes when student, I talk about my prof because I loved him dearly. I used to argue with him. You say, well, how old is your old prof, Colin? If you know. But my old prof used to say, I can show you on a page of every medical textbook a big question mark, unless we've got the evidence. Because in those days, we didn't really start practicing evidence-based medicine, frankly, until the late 70s. And indeed, I'm rather proud to say that my university at Southampton, we were the first to teach formally evidence-based practice, evidence-based medicine in 1980. Okay, it's 40 years ago. And I was part of that drive on this board of medicine to preserve the idea of evidence-based medicine, because we suddenly found that half the treatments we'd got were nothing more than informed best opinion, expert opinion, but no research behind it.
Sure.
And indeed, I did a paper with one of my Bournemouth colleagues in the middle 10s to find that still in NICE, half the treatments were still based expert opinion.
So that's between 2010 and 2015. So you're saying that 50% of treatments were based on opinion rather than evidence.
In 2010, in this analysing NICE structure, and of course it's got so much better. But one of the problems with autism, because I'm now a psychiatric social worker, and they were literally called John and Mary Smith, and they brought this little boy in, Nathan, 8 years old, beautiful looking kid, no quotes, as they said in the textbook, marks of learning disability, or the stigmata of learning disability, things like Down syndrome. This is the language was used. And of course, we're taught these are refrigerator parents. And little Nathan, with my consultant Ian Berg and I talking to the parents and to the kid got very worried and literally started spinning round, and his parents just sat there. And very quickly it showed that Ian Berg and I couldn't calm this kid, and we just sat there as well, etc. But he looked at me and I looked at him and telepathically said, refrigerator parents, right? So they take the kid out and off they go. And we said, well, classic refrigerator parents. But I do the home visit. I knock on the door. And the thing about the Smiths, he ran a garage. And that might have something to do with the child's autism. That's another story. I knock on the door and Mrs. Smith comes. Oh, hello. And suddenly I hear laughter of children. Oh, come in, Mr. Pritchard. Oh, the children. Oh, well, the kids are home for school and everything else. So my husband is playing, and he's got 2 other kids, and he's got 3 kids there, and he's having a lovely time. So I was looking a bit surprised, and she said, oh, you think we're refrigerator parents? Now, there's nothing more embarrassing than the patient knows more than you.
Yeah.
So I kind of, my pomposity as a principal psychiatric social worker.
You were caught out. You were caught out. Yeah.
I was there. So I thought, Mr. Pritchard, let me tell you. When we had Nathan, I realized there's something not right. And I was told, oh, I'm having middle-class fantasies. It's baby blues. He'll grow out of it, etc., etc., etc. It took us years for them to realize, because he showed certain signs of intelligence, but not speech, that he's now got this word autism. And the thing with Leo Kanner, he made an observation and made a false correlation. So disturbed behavior, passive parents, the Smiths had learned the only way to cope with Nathan was calm it. Calm it. And this is the most dangerous thing of all. We see observations and assume cause. Classically, this man Freud, he talked about Oedipal, the Oedipus complex. Now, this is rather embarrassing because I once wrote a paper. In fact, it's the only paper in British Journal of Social Work, A, with multivariate analysis, which meant nobody read it. And the second thing, this may be indicative evidence of the Oedipal configuration. Because what we'd got 3 years of cases of severe school refusals. And what we found with the boys, almost all of them had a good relationship with their mother, or almost too close relation with their mother, and a hostile relationship with their father. With the girl children who were school phobic or school refusers. Half of them were close to their dads and hostile to their mothers, but the other half were simply staying at home because they were there to look after their mother's mental illness, which we didn't recognise. They were frightened their mother would commit suicide while they're away. Having a mentally ill parent is not easy for the children, and with something we've really forgotten. So when I published this paper, a really eminent man, Professor Sir Mike Rutter, the most wonderful empirical clinical psychologist, child psychiatrist. He's written 2 books. If I had my way, they would still be compulsory reading for all social workers, because it tells you about the biopsychosocial interaction. Genetic, you have the part, genetics meet environment, genetics meet social and psychological environment. And what Mike Rutter said, Colin, what you've got here, because this is the 1970s, when divorce was difficult or impossible for ordinary people. People locked in a loveless marriage, and they were warring over the children. And what these parents were doing were getting allies. And once Mike Rutter said that, the dynamics was right. That's what it was. These were warring families, and the children were the battleground. So we can almost go fast forward to Scarborough Park Hospital. I'm now principal psychiatric social worker in the children's unit for the whole of Yorkshire, and we have this is for adolescents. We then have the children's unit, which is going to be in Hyroids, which is an old bin. Sorry, I shouldn't use that word, but that's how we used to call them, because Hyroids was almost exactly similar to Stanley Royd Hospital, where Scarborough Park Hospital had been a private hospital and still had that kind of relaxed ethos. So this is a new unit, adolescent unit. So we had community care, we had a community unit. So there was no hierarchy. And that really allowed Ian Bird to go and do his research and frankly let me run the unit. But I shouldn't be saying that. But that's what really happened, because Ian was too much of an academic, and that was fine. And then we were going to choose a charge nurse to run our children's unit in the old-fashioned hospital. And Ian and I was on the appointing committee by grace, and as the principal nursing officer then said quite clearly, you do realise we're inviting you here as a courtesy, as a professional courtesy. It's our decision, but would be interested in your opinion. So this is to a consultant psychiatrist, chief nursing officer, of course, ex-military. Now, that was not too surprising because I was working in Hyroids, by accident, I found myself teaching them psychiatry. And I was teaching their nurses psychiatry. And of course, they get taught in Hyroids, and there's always been this rivalry with Scarborough Park. And suddenly, for 3 years, this is slightly relevant, our students from Hyroids, my students from Hyroids, do better than Scarborough Park. So I was persona grata, and of course ex-Royal Air Force, and of course Ian Berg had not done national service, and therefore, you know, he knows nothing about the world, etc. So we're sitting there having this charge nurse, and there are 4 candidates, and we said, well, look, Mr. A, B, and C are perfectly valid, whoever, but we don't really want Mr. D. You know what happened, don't you?
Yes.
They chose Mr. D. 2 years later, the complaints, and he's smacking the kids. And I went out, as you do, to try to help your mates, talking to one Yorkshireman to another, etc., ex-servicemen and so on. I said, look, you do not smack children. That's an offence. You could lose your license. You could lose your badge, as it would say. Oh no! Look, I've been brought to bring some bloody order here. We're not having these kids running around shouting, etc., etc. I said, look, this is not the way we work. Oh, look, I run this ward. The doctor can give me, he can tell me the treatment. I'll do it, but I run the ward my way. So I actually pleaded with them. I said, look, if we make this formal, you know, you lose your job. You might even lose your license. They'll back me. So more smacking. So Ian goes to the principal nursing officer. He's called in. Immediately said, oh, we can't have violence against patients. And the guy's sacked just like that. So one of the days, my teaching days, starting a new term at the Sire Royal Hospital. Oh, by the way, I've just been appointed a lecturer at the Department of Psychiatry, University of Leeds, but I felt I would honour my obligation 1 day a week. And Max Hamilton, my professor, said, it's a bloody good thing. Hyroids need somebody like you. You carry on. You've got my, you know, perfectly happy if you teach 2 hours one day a week for a whole term. As I approached the training school, the training unit, the training officer, the nurse tutor, comes almost with tears in his eyes. Colin, I'm sorry. I've been told not to allow you on the building. You're non persona grata. I said, well, look, I know what happened. I know what happened. I've been told you're not allowed on the building. But what about the students? Well, we'll find somebody else. And thank you for all your help, but it's the worst day of my life. I never thought I'd have to say this, but that's how it was. Now, finally, fast forward with a Bournemouth link. Some of our students and some of our colleagues may have met a chap, Professor, he's retired now, but occasionally does sessions, Professor Roger Baker. Roger Baker and I were contemporaries. He was a researcher at the Department of Psychiatry when I was there. And in 1974, Max Hamilton told me about John Hall and Roger Baker's token economy unit. Token economy unit. This was a behavioral idea to try to introduce speech into non-verbal people with schizophrenia who hadn't spoken for 20 years. I said, you must go and see it. So I go back in 1974 on Ward 16, where I'd seen all the horrors of the warehousing, the 2-hourly toilets, and they'd cleaned it up, marvellous, etc. And what they did, the token economy unit was very simple. If a patient spoke to a member of staff, they were given a Smartie or a bar of chocolate or a cigarette. In other words, they were treated like Pavlov's dogs. If you had a social interaction, then you were rewarded. And if you could speak, you were rewarded. Now, what both John and Roger said in their paper, they realised now they were treating the staff as much as the patients. Mm. And I was really impressed. And then suddenly this chap came stumbling towards me. And he raised his hand out and said, "Hey, lad, thou were attendant here, wonder."
Oh, God.
That was George Brown. That was George Brown, Richard.
He was catatonic.
And he was catatonic. The fact he remembers me from nearly 20 years ago meant that the whole of the hell of his life, he knew it was happening. You see, the final two comments I want to make. We as social workers often find ourselves in a position where we have to control because we care. It's a slippery slope. And if you've got long-term chronic or slow change, as you almost inevitably will have with severe physical disability or severe learning disability, the danger of erosion of care.
Yeah. Okay.
So we must always be thinking of how can we inspire the fundamental principles of recognizing our fellow human beings. And we need to be reminded of that, whoever we are, whether we're professors, principal psychiatric social workers, or Corporal Royal Air Force. It's been a long journey from Lunatic Asylum to psychiatric unit. For Richard, there's still echoes there.
Look, there is a question. It comes to me, and you kind of responded to that. I mean, that is an extraordinary journey, and I'm struck by when I interrupted you, and I was reflecting upon where you were in the 1950s or the 60s. Where you were, not you, but what was happening was cutting edge, you know,
At the time.
yeah, of the time, which is where we are now in 2021. I mean, we are at the cutting edge. That's where we are. And in 30 years' time, it's quite possible that someone will be doing a recording and doing a reflection on the journey and looking back and wondering, putting that into a historical perspective in terms of the quality of practice. And I think that has always been the case and always will be the case. So my question is, and it's not a fair question because I don't think I can expect you to answer it. So what do we do? What's the mechanism that we as individuals, what's the measure that we can bring, or what's the reflection that we bring that allows us to always be asking those questions, if that makes sense? Does that make sense as a question?
Yes, it does. Can I tell you about Max Hamilton, my old professor?
Yeah, of course.
I went to the interview in obviously 1980, and I was the fourth candidate, and get into the interview, and it goes well. One chap said, he was talking about my statistical papers, etc. You know, he actually said in the interview, this is the man for me. If I've got a social worker who can do statistics and be a practitioner, this is the man for me, etc. And the interview was going brilliantly until it came to Max. And Max said to the chair, oh, I've known Colin Pritchard for over a decade. I know him to be difficult, at times opinionated and stubborn. So, do you know other questions, Professor Hamilton? No. So, I mean, I was flabbergasted. This is the head of department and no further questions. So I kind of stagger out in a kind of daze, get back to the other lads, and we all had a bad time with Max. And suddenly the registrar of the university came 10 minutes later, would Colin Pritchard come back? And I genuinely thought they were about to say, how dare you apply to Leeds University? You know, as a Yorkshireman, this was Nirvana. And they offered me the job. I was a bit flabbergasted. So we were all shaking hands, etc. And the chair said, you know, Professor Hamilton will take you, see the unit, etc., etc. So as we were going, I said, well, right. He said, yes. So I said, Prof, Colin, he says, you're a colleague now, so it's Max. So I said, in that case, Max, why the hell did you say what you said? There you are, you've proved my point. And then he said something to me. I'm surrounded by yes men. I want somebody to ask me questions. Without asking questions, I stop learning. And then this is the Max I love most of all. He would say at the cutting edge of the time, colleagues, you're amongst the elite of society. You're medically trained, you're nursing trained, you're social work trained. Most of our patients have had a shit awful deal, particularly socioeconomically. Therefore, they need and deserve only our best. And our best may not be good enough. So therefore, we must always be reflecting on how good it is, how effective it is, and we must always be trying to do better. That's Max Hamilton's dictum, which I've taken into my research and practice.
Okay, fine. You answered it. Thank you for that. Okay. Well done. Nice one. Yeah.